Hey guys, we are going to start our next session a bit early. We have Zan here, a growth partner at Blockstack, and he'll be doing a talk on proof of transfer, deep dive. And I'll let him take it from here.
Awesome. Thank you, Shinzu. Can I just get some comments in the chat? Make sure you all can hear me. Just one or two yeses would be good enough. Awesome. Thank you. Thanks everyone for joining me today. This is exciting. It's the first fully virtual conference I've really presented at, and so thanks for joining me from all around the world. Today we are going to take a deep dive into Blockstack's new consensus mechanism called proof of transfer, or POX. If you attended our co-founder Munib Ali's talk on Friday of this conference, you'll be familiar with proof of transfer at a high level. But today we're going to take a much closer look at the mechanics of proof of transfer. So with that, let me dive into the presentation. This is just a disclaimer. Our public Reg A filing for tokens is no longer live, but this is still not a sale for anything, and it does contain forward-looking statements. I'm going to start with a quick Blockstack overview just to make sure we're on the same page. To start briefly, what is Blockstack and what have we done to date? Blockstack, I really think of as part of this new era of the internet we are just beginning to enter today. We at Blockstack create software to grow internet ownership. Another way of thinking about this, especially with the Stacks 2.0 mainnet upgrade launching in the coming months, is we really see ourselves as potentially Web 3.0 on top of Bitcoin. And when I say Web 3.0 on top of or anchored to Bitcoin, what I mean is that while both the ownership of digital assets and identities, as well as the execution of smart contracts, are recorded on the Stack chain, on our chain, they are ultimately also anchored to Bitcoin. And we'll see quite shortly exactly how that's accomplished. A couple of you, if you've been following Blockstack for a while, may be confused when I say upcoming mainnet, as we've actually had the Stacks 1.0 network live since 2017. We've accomplished a lot with that infrastructure, including growing the independent application ecosystem that's built on top of it and the technology to over 400 projects. The purpose of that initial network was really to prove out our design thesis and that the technology could handle apps at scale. Since the release of that original network, however, we've been working on releasing the further full vision, which will be the Stacks 2.0 chain and network. The Stacks 2.0 upgrade builds on top of what the 1.0 network already offered, adding key pieces to enable a user-owned internet, takes the same Blockstack primitives, Blockstack identity or authentication, as well as Gaia storage. And on top of it, it adds the new consensus algorithm specifically, which is what allows the network to anchor security in Bitcoin, while providing a unique experience and feature set on our network that can include things like Clarity smart contracts without modifying Bitcoin's core protocol. And so with that, let's actually dive into the meat of this presentation, which is proof of transfer, or POX, as a novel consensus mechanism. I actually think of proof of transfer as a novel category of consensus mechanisms. Here we see a super high level view of some of the most commonly used consensus mechanism categories. I think we're all familiar with proof of work, proof of stake. There are lots of different flavors and different types kind of within these broad categories, DPoS, so on. I think we're kind of all familiar with those. Proof of burn was actually what the Stacks 2.0 upgrade was going to use as its consensus mechanism before we developed proof of transfer. And I actually think of proof of transfer is a generalized form of proof of burn. Another way of putting it is proof of burn is a type of proof of transfer where you are taking a base cryptocurrency and you are destroying it in order to mint units of a new cryptocurrency. Another way of thinking of that is you're actually transferring the base cryptocurrency to an unrecoverable address. So proof of transfer does the same thing, but you can transfer the base cryptocurrency, in Blockstack's case, Bitcoin, to different places to create additional incentives on the network. And we'll take a look at what that can look like in a second. In the case of Blockstack's implementation of proof of transfer, we're anchoring the network to Bitcoin as the underlying asset. Right here is really the simple mental model I use to think about how proof of transfer works at a high level. There are really two types of participation in the Stacks 2.0 proof of transfer: miners or Stacks miners and stackers. STX miners send or pay Bitcoin to the protocol in order to compete to earn Stacks tokens. So miners send Bitcoin, earn Stacks tokens. Stackers add value to the network and lock up their tokens and receive Bitcoin as a result. It's the same Bitcoin that's been sent by the miners. The protocol forwards it on. So there's a lot of detail in those two statements, but just keeping them both in mind will help keep both the direction and type of asset flow within the system much clearer as we dive deeper and things get a little more complex. And so this is a higher level view of a little bit more details of how proof of transfer works. There's still a bit of information missing from this, but those details are better dealt with individually, and we'll do so shortly. Here you can see the flow of assets just described on the last slide. STX miners on the left are sending Bitcoin to the protocol to compete to mine. The miner who wins the leader election is receiving the Coinbase reward of 500 Stacks tokens and is appending that new block. At the same time, in the upper middle, you have Stacks token holders who are locking up their tokens, completing requirements to stack, which we'll cover shortly, and they are receiving the Bitcoin that the miners have committed to the protocol as a reward. Now to start diving into the pieces of this, first let's go through STX or Stacks mining and how it actually works. One of the big advantages I think about when I think of Stacks mining is it doesn't require any special hardware or CPU capacity, which, especially compared to other proof of work-based networks, is a lot more advantageous just for making it easier for anyone to get involved. All you need to participate in Stacks mining is any amount of Bitcoin. Anyone who wants to compete to mine can do so by sending any amount of Bitcoin to the proof of transfer mechanism or to the protocol, along with the block they are proposing to append. The proof of transfer protocol takes each Bitcoin commit by each miner as an input, and it combines each of those inputs with a verifiable random function, or a VRF, in order to run the leader election. The way the VRF plays into that competition is the more Bitcoin a miner commits to compete to mine, the higher their chances of winning that block. But the VRF always introduces some randomness, which is independent block to block. Now let's take a quick look at how stacking works in a little more detail, which is quite a bit more complex than mining. Stacking is when Stacks token holders lock up their tokens and add value to the network in exchange, the protocol forwards them the Bitcoin that has been committed by competing miners. Stacking sounds very similar to staking, but there are some important differences. One, at a high level or at a meta level, Stacks miners really are the participants who are securing the network. Stacking provides an extra incentive for miners to be honest, which we'll go over shortly, as well as makes the network more decentralized, as to be a stacker probably requires running a full node, and we'll go over that shortly as well. But if stacking were to break down, it's not the same as, let's say, a validator system on a DPoS network. If stacking were to break down, the Stacks 2.0 network would still function correctly. It could still make progress. The consensus mechanism would simply switch to proof of burn rather than rewarding the stackers if there is kind of dysfunction happening in that system. And we have that programmed in at the protocol level in terms of how and when it switches. But to switch back to how stacking actually functions, stacking runs on roughly a 10 or 11-day cycle. These lengths right here are still potentially subject to a little bit of change, as stacking hasn't been released on our testnet yet. But it should be roughly 10 to 11 days for a stacking cycle. There are two phases of a cycle. There's the prepare phase, which is 100 blocks long. This is when anyone who wants to compete in anyone who wants to participate, not compete, in the upcoming stack cycle completes all the requirements. This is about 100 blocks long, or roughly a day. The requirements to actually be a stacker is you have to lock up your Stacks token holdings, and you have to broadcast during the prepare phase a signed message to the Stacks network with proof that your tokens are locked up, a Bitcoin address that you can receive funds at, and support for a Stacks chain tip. The support for a Stacks chain tip is probably what requires you to be running a Stacks node. These are really easy to run, by the way. You should be able to run a full Stacks node on mobile by the time it's released on mainnet. But for the most part, signaling support for a chain tip is going to be very straightforward. There's not going to be competing chain tips, but in the case that there is a contentious fork on our network or potentially on the Bitcoin layer, we need to be able to allow miners, as well as the rest of the people in the network, to select the proper kind of longest chain in terms of the Stacks chain. And this provides an extra incentive to keep miners honest. In addition, there is a threshold requirement in terms of how many stacks you have to hold to be eligible to stack individually just yourself with nothing but your holdings. That threshold is equal to 0.02% of the circulating supply of Stacks tokens. Right now, there's a bit over 400 million Stacks tokens. That equates to, I believe, 94,000, or to round up 100,000 Stacks tokens, or roughly something around $15,000. Now, even though this is a threshold requirement, it's not actually a requirement to participate. We want stacking to be open and available to all, just like Stacks mining. We definitely don't want this to be a rich person's only game. And so that threshold, again, is not a requirement to participate in stacking, because the protocol also supports pooling and delegation natively. What that means is, as a Stacks holder, if I hold less than the threshold, I can either on my own, on a peer-to-peer level, find and pool with other Stacks holders to meet that minimum threshold, or as time goes on, I can find a service that provides pooling or delegation services on top of Stacks, not just allowing me to pool my holdings with others, but potentially doing things like completing the requirements to stack each cycle on my behalf. And I can delegate or pool to any individual or entity without moving my tokens whatsoever or giving up custody for them. So we enable that in a really, really nice way. The reason for that 0.02% threshold to do it individually is twofold, and is pretty important to this functioning properly. Otherwise, we wouldn't have done it, because it does introduce some annoying complexity into this. But the reasons are: one, it limits the amount of space we take up in Bitcoin blocks as a result of transactions related to stacking. And I think even more importantly on our network, it limits the total number of addresses that the protocol has to pay out for stacking each stacking cycle. The way the protocol actually pays out for a stacking cycle is every single time a block is mined, it pays out 5 of the addresses that it includes in this list called the reward set, which has the Bitcoin address for every eligible stacker for that cycle. Once it's paid out 5 of those addresses, it removes those from the reward set, and it continues to do this until it's cycled through every address in there. At that time, the reward cycle ends and a new prepare phase begins. If the threshold to compete in stacking, hypothetically, was you just had to hold 1 stacks token, then it would take potentially the protocol would have to pay out over 400 million stacks addresses per cycle, which would just not be sustainable. And so that's the reason for the threshold. But again, and we're about to go into this now, I actually don't think, I think very quickly we're going to see services and products springing up that allow anyone to do this, one, without any technical friction if they want that abstracted away. So people like my parents, for instance, could participate in either or both of these activities, or in addition to that, I think people will also want to pool together for a variety of reasons. And so next, I kind of want to get into this by talking about what I see as the opportunities with stacks mining and stacking that exist. The way I kind of think about these opportunities and some of the points that I start from are on the left here, and are really that I do have this hypothesis that over time, most participants will not engage in just stacks mining or stacking, but will actually converge, and the vast majority will do both. The reason for this is it creates this economic flywheel where you can enter this flywheel from multiple different points. But let's say I have some stacks tokens and I start stacking them. Makes sense. I don't really have to do much, and I'm getting Bitcoin for that value that I'm providing for the network, running a node and sending a signed message once every 10 days. While I'm getting, small amounts of Bitcoin over time for doing that, I can do a back of the envelope calculation and figure out if it's worth my while to maybe use some of that Bitcoin. Sure, I can save it, store a value that's growing over time, but I can also use it to opportunistically mine. I can look at it as kind of fuel for opportunistically mining on the Stacks chain as it makes economic sense, or taking advantage of arbitrage opportunities, things like that. And so I do think we'll kind of see that happen, but I will be watching that quite a bit. On top of that, Blockstack PBC, the current core team, is only really developing the underlying protocol. Not currently, and not in the foreseeable future, focused on building the services and the tools on top of proof of transfer. And lastly, on top of those two things, there is a market demand for a lot of this, at least an initial demand. The minimum way of quantifying this that I use is there's currently 4,000 to 5,000 current stack holders who will need to use a pooling or delegation service to stack, and will be looking for other tools and resources around this as well. So on the right, pooling delegation services, I think we will see those stand up. I've actually, I think that could look very similar to how you have different staking services offered by validators currently. At the same time, I think you could also provide both those services within a wallet, within an exchange, within an application, pretty much anywhere that individuals are holding their digital assets and looking for returns on them. I really think of stacking as providing censorship-resistant Bitcoin rewards, which is pretty cool. And then lastly, there's just a lot of tools and resources for stacks, miners, and stackers. Everything from different types of node or block explorers to we actually have a community member who just made a stacking calculator that, depending on some fixed variables, lets you estimate the amount of Bitcoin that you could earn as a result of participating in stacking. But in terms of this being featured in a wallet or something like that, this is actually exactly how I think this could be done. If any of you have used something like Argent Wallet, I think stacking and even mining could be offered as just one product within kind of that wallet suite of offerings pretty easily. And it's something I expect to see fairly quickly. Briefly, just to kind of go further down the rabbit hole, those are some of the obvious things that I think I have a lot of confidence we're going to see in the near term. Long term, I think proof of transfer also enables some really interesting things potentially. Some of these are still kind of high level and vague, but when I think about these, I kind of think about what the points on the left mean as you go further out into the future. So with proof of transfer, you have a growing set of network participants who maintain locked up collateral for the purpose of stacking. That's important because you can repurpose that locked up collateral for a lot of different use cases. You can use it potentially to create stable coins. You could maybe use it as the basis for lending. I think we may see some of what we're currently seeing in DeFi more on top of the Ethereum space, but I think we could see some of that here based on Bitcoin. And similarly, I think you also have a growing set of network participants who are receiving a future cash flow in the form of Bitcoin from stacking that can be modeled and built for. I think you can maybe use this to enable other DeFi functions. You could also use this to enable this idea we've had, and I think Balaji Srinivasan's also talked to a bit, called proof of HODL. This is basically using economic skin in the game as access control. In the Web 2.0 world, we have these data moats where we as users get locked into applications, platforms, because they hold and control all our data, and that over time makes it such that the switching cost is just too high. We don't really have that in the Web 3.0 world, but one way we can recreate that, but in a way that also rewards the user for getting locked in a little bit, is through this idea of, let's say, in order to access an application, I not only have to have my Blockstack ID, but I also have to, let's say, lock up 10,000 tokens for that application. Well, maybe that application can leverage that collateral for development or to do things. Maybe the economic skin in the game that gives me as an application, if in the application, maybe as an early user, I can get rewarded based on that collateral that I have essentially staked on this application. So hodling as an idea for kind of access control is an interesting idea too here that we're thinking a lot about. One of the other influences too is that proof of transfer can be stacked vertically as needed for use cases with either new networks, new applications, or even individual users and data. This is a whole other rabbit hole to go down, but this is what we call app chains. App chains is a concept that exists on a couple different networks. For us, basically it means just like how we leverage Bitcoin with proof of transfer, you could create a whole new network on top of Blockstack's proof of transfer that is using Stacks tokens as the underlying asset being transferred and is being used to mint its whole own new token with its own miners. And you could have that be public mining. So if you want to throw up a new network, this allows you to throw up a whole new network that is essentially gives you everything a standalone network would give, but with bootstrapped security from day one. This can also be used for applications if they're very computational heavy, if they make a lot of use of smart contracts. And then lastly, you could even do this, an individual user could do this to provide themselves with kind of clear provenance over their data and sharing and access control to it. And they could even do this by having themselves be the only miner as defined on their app chain. This is a very deep rabbit hole to go down, but wanted to give a little bit of a taste here. And definitely reach out to me. I'll have my contact info at the end if you're interested in getting into any of these. Super quick, since I know we're starting to run a minute or two over. Right now, we are really heads down looking at the mainnet release of the Stacks 2.0 upgrade. We are scheduling that for June, possibly might happen more in July. But right now, this is kind of some of the further steps we have on the way to launching that testnet and some of the pieces around it. Right now, the testnet is live and it's in its first phase called Neon. The focus at the moment is just on getting a node up and running and sending some transactions. Shortly, later this week, we'll be adding in Stacks mining functionality before announcing some bounties and incentives in the coming week. And you can kind of see that this is kind of a cool chart showing how much the code base has turned over really in the last few years, but specifically in the last few months. And I would say our kind of busyness has only ramped up with COVID-19. And so as you can see, if you want to check out the testnet, see what's going on, go to testnet.blockstack.org. All the information is there. At the moment, you can stand up a node, create a Clarity smart contract, try the CLI wallet, and we'll have a lot more coming shortly there. And with that, we'd just like to say thank you. If anyone wants to join our public Discord, link is there. Easiest way to reach out to me is probably just on Twitter. I'm @Zandikov. Feel free to shoot me a note. I think my DMs are open. And yeah, with that, I'd like to say thank you for all your time. And let me switch back to Crowdcast and we will open this up for questions. Yeah, Kieran, stacking stacks or stacking sats. Yeah, it's definitely one thing that's interesting actually is I think where this may go, we started researching this for longer term, depending on what happens with our network and the Bitcoin network. And especially as our network grows over the future, I think we are pretty heavily researching being able to use Lightning channels in the future, both for stacks mining and potentially for stacking. A lot of questions still to be answered there. I think the Lightning Labs team needs to continue to do some development and continue the great work they've been doing. But so I think at some point in the near future, you might be able to stack sats in order to stack stacks. But anyway. Cool. So yeah, if anyone has any questions, I think we got about 4 or 5 more minutes, and just throw them in the ask a question box. If you come up with a question after that you want to ask around this, feel free to reach out to me on Twitter, and we'll also be sharing these slides at some point as well. And if anyone is interested in working through any of the challenges with proof of transfer, whether it's just getting stood up as an individual on Testnet, or it's thinking about some of the products and services, tools and resources that need to get built, join our Discord. There's a number of community working groups that meet weekly and focus on these things. Great question. Thank you, RV. What would be the minimum investment to run a node on mainnet? So it's super minimal. I would say there's 2 ways right now that I would do it. The biggest investment is just space. I think you can think of running a full Blockstack node as similar to running a full Bitcoin node. You can do that in 2 ways. A community member of ours actually made a step-by-step kind of live streamed him step-by-step setting up a Blockstack node on a Raspberry Pi. So he just has his node running on a Raspberry Pi pretty constantly. Any laptop really should be able to run a full node, no problem. The other way you can do it too is just deploying it to a cloud-based instance to, AWS, Docker, something like that. So super easy to do. I'm not an engineer by trade, and I have a node up and running right now, and that's even while at the moment we're still CLI based, so pretty easy. Okay, how does Blockstack already have so many applications deployed? So these are all independent applications. That's actually been one of my main focuses over the last 3 years on the team, has been getting those initial applications developed and then growing that independent ecosystem. I would say there's kind of two big reasons why we have so many apps, especially compared to some other projects. One is we had a developer incentive program that was running for a little over a year. We've paused it, and we're going to be starting it up back again, possibly later this year. Right now, we're just focused on the mainnet upgrade. But that was app mining. Basically, app mining uses a distributed ranking system to rank any application that uses Blockstack technology over different parameters of quality. And rewards at the time during the pilot, it was Bitcoin across every application every month, with higher ranked getting more than lower ranked. So that was one reason, it was something that we were incentivizing. But I also think a huge reason is because, especially to develop applications on the 1.0 network and to develop, certainly simple applications on the 2.0 network, even things like password keepers, encrypted messengers, you don't have to be a blockchain developer. You don't have to know how to do anything on chain. All you have to know is simple JavaScript. And so pretty much any web developer can build a Blockstack app pretty quickly. What that allowed us to do is it kind of allowed us to target developers that are not in this ecosystem, which, that number is growing, but it's still a tiny number compared to the blue ocean of developers that exists. So yeah, I think those two played a big role, but 2019, I think we saw something like 200 or 300 applications get developed and come online. And some of these are very simple and hackathon style. Some are quite nice. Hey, Shinzu.
Hey, so we can probably take one last question, and then we need to transition.
Yep, perfect. So there's just one more. So Jimmy, I would love to elaborate on that. I think the elaboration happens once that exists. So again, Blockstack PVC, the core team, is not building kind of those tools and resources and products that fold things like stacking into wallets or other applications. I do think that's pretty simple to do. I do think you could do it as simply, you could have a delegator service that has a wallet. The way that they show things in wallet is you can see your Stacks token balance, and there's a button right there that basically says, I want to stack. This is how many stacks I want to stack, and this is how long I want to delegate it for. And it's a button. You do it right there. So I do think that's possible, but that is more kind of the vision of where I see things going right now. It's not something we are focused on as a core team in the foreseeable future. Awesome. Well, with that, wanted to say thank you, everyone. Thank you, Shinzu, for putting this on. This is an awesome weekend. And yeah, thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you so much for the really great talk. We're going to transition now to the next session.
Beautiful.
Thanks again.